In this video, I'm going back to one of the subjects from the first year of this channel, base camps. One of the videos I wanted to do back then was on Viet Cong and NVA base camps. Well, I finally got off my butt and started looking for some information, and what I found is there is not a lot of information out there on this subject. But I will give you the information I did get. I could find only one actual report from the U.S. Department of Defense from during the Vietnam War about Viet Cong base camps. If I can find it online, I will put a link in the description for you to read it. It is from something called Counterinsurgency's Lessons Learned. It's one of the issues, and it covers base camps and Viet Cong logistics. The two complement each other, obviously, because a base camp is also the supply point for that area. Now, remember, there are 3 levels in the Viet Cong organization, if you want to think of it for force size and capabilities and so forth. You have the local defense forces, the local groups, which are based around a village. Those units would have multiple smaller base camps that they would operate out of in their little region around their hamlet, around their village. These base camps would be just large enough for that unit, whether it is squad size or platoon size. Larger than that, the next level up, you had the regional forces. These are ones that would operate, say, in comparison, say, across an entire county or a section of that state, like multiple counties. They would have larger bases, and their bases typically would have a maintenance force that is assigned there between squad size to platoon size. It was noticed in operations before the 10th offensive. You could have a base camp would have at least a squad base there to maintain it. After the Tet Offensive, it was not uncommon that even the larger base camps would only have 2 or 3 people left to maintain that camp. And that force was expected to also improve the camp continuously, along with keeping it hidden, keeping it maintained, and also maintaining the supplies that are hidden at that base camp. The next level up from the regional was your main force units. These would be considered your more conventional type units. They'd have a little more organization, better weapons, and they would operate, say, in an entire state or half of a state, or in the case of Vietnam, a province. And there were multiple main force units inside every province, and they would move back and forth between the different base camps which are hidden around in that province. The sizes of the camps varied on the size of the unit. Obviously, a squad size camp is considerably smaller than one that would be occupied by a battalion. The average base camp size that was encountered was approximately company size, and its size was under 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. In the report, it looks like between 500 meters to 750 meters on each side. They were typically in a circular pattern, but that circle was adjusted according to terrain. The larger camps would have things that the smaller camps didn't, especially if it was a training camp. They would have rifle ranges in the center of the camp that you would hear the shots maybe if you were outside it, but there'd be no way you could locate it if you were to counterinsurgent. Now, if it's a regimental size unit, they didn't have one giant operating base like the U.S. had. They would have smaller base camps, say battalion size and smaller, that would be spread out in that area, and they would all be mutually supporting. And conceivably, they would have communications, most likely landlines, field telephones connecting the different camps together, so that if one camp is getting attacked, they can get on that field phone, contact the main telephone center, And then, one of the other camps could provide mortar fire, rocket fire, or send over reinforcements, whatever was required. Now, some of the basic criteria that the U.S. military noticed. First off, every base camp was located within 200 to 500 meters of water, and primarily rivers, streams, and canals. So this camp, the outer edge of its defensive rings would be 200 to 500 meters away from the water. I know it's kind of cramped on here. That's because of the board and trying to get stuff put in there. Second off, once they found a location near water, it had to have good drainage so that there wouldn't be standing water in the camp after a rain, especially during the monsoons. Standing water is breeding areas for mosquitoes. Mosquitoes spread disease, especially in Southeast Asia. So they made sure that each base camp had very good drainage. Now, after those two criteria were found, that is when they would choose defendability. You found a spot, can you defend it from the counterinsurgent long enough for the majority of that unit to evacuate while your stay-behind defensive forces were slowing the counterinsurgent? After that, if you got defendability, then it's locate multiple escape routes. And there was multiple escape routes on every edge. So if they would get attacked from this direction, they would evacuate from this side, going multiple directions. Now, these escape routes were not always obvious to the counterinsurgent. So you're probably thinking, oh yeah, well they're using tunnels. Not always. There is a note in the report of one particular base camp. It had a major river on one side. It had rice paddy fields on the other side, and a very narrow approach from this direction and this direction. U.S. forces figured, oh, we'll get them trapped, close them off, because we'll have a kill zone over here, kill zone over here. They're going to have to surrender. Well, when they attacked, the unit escaped. There was escape routes that the counterinsurgent didn't even find after they swept the area. Now, the camp itself. First off, you're going to have multiple rings of defense. You're going to have your LPOPs, which are going to be located outside your defensive rings. How far? Well, it could be 500 meters, could be 1,000 meters, could be 2,000 meters away. And those listening post observation posts could be connected by a field phone. They could be connected by a radio, or the more common, runners. You'd have, say, a fire team at that listening post observation post. The counterinsurgent would approach. They would send a runner back who would run through the jungle with the minimum amount of gear to warn everyone back here that, hey, there's an attack coming from up here. Now, you would also have security patrols that would move around also between that region of the listening post observation post and your ring of defense. So you'd have squad-sized patrols, fire team patrols moving around, checking, making sure that there wasn't reconnaissance teams overwatching the base camp. Now, you typically had 2 rings of defense around the base camp. Each ring contained bunkers, trenches, foxholes, and rifle pits, aka spider holes. It was found that a lot of the bunkers, especially if the camp's been there a long time, will have tunnels connecting each bunker together, and they found also tunnels linking bunkers to trench lines. I have a couple trench lines I threw in here. And it was not uncommon for the tunnels to also meet up with some of the rifle pits or foxholes. So you could have someone fighting from that rifle pit, that foxhole. You know they're there, you're getting close, you're getting ready to toss a grenade in. The person inside sees he's probably screwed. drops down through a hatch in the bottom of that pit, gets into the tunnel, and then moves off to a different location. That GI tosses in a hand grenade, it goes off, he goes up there, checks the pit, sprays it with rounds, and there's nobody in there because the person escaped through a concealed trap door. You would have a couple lines, and these could be mutually supporting. So if there's a battle going on here, this line potentially could provide fire to help them out also. You would also have supporting weapons located inside the camp itself. That is typically where they would put mortar pits or rocket pits to provide indirect fire to support your outer ring defenses here if needed. The camps typically were circular, as I mentioned, and it was adjusted according to terrain. Roughly the center or near the center is where the headquarters would be. And the headquarters, for the most part, was in a bunker dug into the ground. You would also have a field kitchen located in the center. And my guess is figure one field kitchen for every company size unit. So if it's a battalion, you probably have one kitchen per company unit. And there was at least one hospital depending on the size of the base camp. Now, depending on how long the camp is there, these three things, the headquarters, the kitchen, and the hospital, were dug into bunkers. Those were the first things to get put in the ground. Spread around this so that the troops were close to their assigned area on the perimeter, you would have sleeping areas. These sleeping areas could be bunkers. They could be just raised platforms so that the people wouldn't be sleeping on the ground in the mud with the snakes and the bugs. They could be just areas that the trees were close enough together that they could tie their hammocks and then swing in the breeze and that stuff. Something would happen, jump out of the hammock, put their sandals on, run to their assigned position. And located nearby each of the sleep areas, you would have an eating area / classroom area. The Viet Cong did conduct classes with their troops to improve their capabilities. Teach them on a new captured weapon they got from the Americans. Teach them on that new radio that just came in from communist China. Teach them on that new heavy machine gun they just got from Russia. Teach them a new tactic on how to engage helicopters, how to infiltrate a base. So you had that combination area, so while the people are there eating, they're probably also having a class conducted. That would also be the location where they would have their political classes conducted by the political officers. One thing that I only found mentioned in one report, latrines were not located inside the base camp. They were usually located outside the base camp. So it would be, say, 25 to 50 meters outside the perimeter. It would be, and I think the reason for that should be pretty obvious. It's to cut down on insects, cut down on flies spreading disease and that type of thing. And that is the basic information I could find on one of their base camps. There's not a hell of a lot. Remember, there was no set Viet Cong doctrine. They didn't have set manuals they were going off of. So they conformed what they needed to what was available, made the situation work for them. Every base camp was always easily concealed. If there was any areas that the troops could be caught in the open, if a reconnaissance aircraft, a helicopter went by, typically they would string camouflage netting in between the trees. I know I read this in a book somewhere of a Viet Cong soldier mentioning U.S. helicopters were sighted coming to the general location where base camp was, They were located for a giant political gathering. Well, the warning went out, helicopters en route. They grabbed a camouflage net that was rolled up behind them or bundled up behind them, passed it over their heads, and they just held it above them to camouflage the entire area. No one would see they were there as the helicopter would fly past. Once the helicopter was far enough away, it wasn't circling back, then they'd feed the net back to the bundle behind them, and then they would continue their class or their entertainment. Field kitchens, I tried finding information on this. How were they set up? How were they prepared? I couldn't find dick. All right, there was nothing out there. I know I have come across in fiction books written by LRP veterans, Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol veterans. They mentioned in base camps you would find pits essentially dug in their kitchen area, and the fires to cook the rice and that stuff was done down inside these pits. The depth of the pit was basically the height of a soldier. I came across some things which are questionable, where they showed a drawing essentially or an example of a Viet Cong kitchen where it was dug down, say to waist height, and then they had a stove / oven type system set up similar as what was in the tunnels. So you'd have the narrow little hole on top that your pot would sit over. Directly underneath that, you would have where you would put the firewood, and then the heat would come up from that through that hole to heat the pot. I could not get confirmation that that's what was actually in the base camps, or were they just giving an example for people to see of what it looked like inside a tunnel. But, you know, I'm sure there were units that did that. And then these field kitchens, I did come across, the only information I found was it had overhead cover. So it had essentially like a hut type roof over the top. Air could circulate through, which would cut down on heat signature and allowed the smoke to dissipate. I also found a reference that said the food was not prepared in a Viet Cong base camp during the daytime. It was only prepared at night to cut down the visibility of the smoke from the cook fires. And cook fires were always hidden. And that's about the only information I could find. Now, logistics. Each one of these camps were somewhat self-sustaining. They had sufficient stockpiles of food, medical supplies, ammunition, and obviously water source that they could maintain themselves in a siege situation for as long as needed. That's all there was in the report on that. How much food was located there? Well, it could be a few hundred pounds in the case of a local squad size Viet Cong force base camp in the woods protecting a hamlet. Could be a few hundred pounds of rice and other preserved foods that they smuggled in or were brought into them. And in the larger base camps, battalion size and even some of the company size that were overrun by Western forces, they would easily find 80 tons of rice, 100 tons of rice, 200 tons of rice. I found mentioned in the reports, or in there, mentioned was recovered from overrun base camps. This rice was located and set up, preserved in ways to prevent moisture getting into the rice and prevent rodents and insects from getting inside also. That's what I got. So hopefully you can find some more information. I didn't, but this at least gives you somewhat of an idea. There was no set pattern, but there was set criteria essentially for selecting the base camps. At least that's what US Intel found out. Now, for all my engineer brothers in the Patriot Militia movements, always remember, essay ons.